finally got its 18th sanctions package on Russia over the line, which includes a ban on transactions with 22 Russian banks, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, and any use of the Nordstream pipelines. Russia will also face a lower price cap on its oil exports as the EU seeks to exert maximum pressure on Russia and its war machine to get Vladimir Putin to commit to a ceasefire. But just how effective will these new sanctions really be? Now joining me to discuss is Sir William Browder, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us on World News Tonight.
Great to be here.
Now, Kaja Kallas has called this sanctions package the strongest to date. In your opinion, what did the EU get right in this newest package?
Well, the EU continues to be the leader, I would say, in sanctioning Russia. It used to be the United States, but as the Trump administration has pulled back and sort of shown Putin a lot more friendliness, it's the EU that's leading. And the fact that there's now 18 different sanctions packages from the EU shows just how serious the EU is. I would point out, though, that every aspect of the sanctions policy continues to be sort of incremental and gradual as opposed to devastating and overwhelming. There's one thing that can be done that would put Russia out of business. And to know what that thing is to look at a piece of legislation which is being proposed in the United States, which would basically punish anybody who buys Russian oil. This is the Lindsey Graham proposal. And the idea would be to put a 500% tariff on anybody who buys Russian oil. If that were to ever happen from the United States, or if the EU were to sign on to that, people like India or countries like India and China would not buy Russian oil. If they don't buy Russian oil, Putin doesn't get the money. If he doesn't get the money, he can't afford the war, and he'd be out of business. And so while I applaud the 18th sanctions package from the EU, if we look at it, does it put Russia out of business? No, it's incremental, it's marginal. It makes life a little bit more difficult for people in Russia and for Putin, but it doesn't put them out of business.
Right, and when we look at this oil price cap, it sounds good, but how effective is it really? I mean, you know, Russian oil already sells at a discount, number one, when you compare it to Brent. And, you know, what are the mechanisms that the EU can actually enforce this without the United States, for instance, on board? I know that's something they've been trying to push through in the G7 for a couple months now.
Well, the oil price cap is kind of a way of being seen to do something and not actually doing that much, because Russia has figured out how to get around the price cap. They've got this whole shadow fleet of ships that basically allow them to defy the price cap. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's nobody wants the oil price to go up dramatically, and that would happen if Russia wasn't able to sell its oil. So, but we have this situation where we come up with these sort of half measures, an oil price cap. Russia can continue to sell the oil. They can work their way around this price cap. They get hundreds of billions of dollars a year from the sale of oil. They spend that money on Ukraine. And then we've got to spend the money helping Ukraine defend themselves. And so something's got to give. And I think that ultimately the way to put Russia out of business is to not let them sell their oil at all. And the best way to do that is to punish the buyers of the oil. They buy the oil. There's plenty of countries that buy the oil because it's a good deal. If all of a sudden it became a bad deal to buy the oil, they wouldn't. And so I really do think that all this stuff is just incremental and marginal, and we need to bite the bullet and do something which actually puts these guys out of business.
That makes a lot of sense. And well, Donald Trump has given 50 days. Well, the time is ticking. It should be at about the beginning of September. Now, if the Graham bill goes through and sanctions are placed, secondary sanctions on, say, India and China, I believe Trump is now talking about 100% instead of the 500% that was mentioned in the bill, but let's say 100%. How long do you think that needs to be in place in order to cripple the Kremlin's war machine?
Well, if it actually happens, I think it would almost immediately cripple the war machine. Russia doesn't have access to any borrowed money. They can't go and borrow money from the international capital markets. And so the way that they've been able to function is by selling this oil. If all of a sudden the oil became not profitable to buy, nobody would buy it. And so what would happen? I mean, there'll probably be somebody out there who buys it who doesn't do business with the United States, but the price would be dramatically lower, much lower than any lowered price cap. And Russia would basically not have that money. And if they don't have that money, they don't have the money to buy missiles and pay their soldiers and all that kind of stuff. And so how long would it take before they have to come to the table and do a peace negotiation? I think it would be pretty quick. I think that the Russian economy is not in great shape. And if you did that to them, it would really be put Putin in a desperate situation. Very quick.
Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, among many other voices around the world, have said many times that the EU taxpayers should not foot the bill for Russia's war of aggression and should seize the frozen assets that are in Europe as a way to either help Ukraine pay for its current defense or Ukraine's reconstruction. What do you think the major holdup is here, and what needs to get accomplished in order for these funds, these hundreds of billions of dollars, to be seized and not just frozen and given to Ukraine?
Well, I mean, it's obvious that money should be taken. Russia started this war. It's a war of aggression. Ukraine was an innocent victim. Russia has done more damage to Ukraine than $300 billion. And that money is frozen now in the West, and it should be confiscated. Now, the people who object to it being confiscated throw up their hands and say, well, there's a matter of what about the sovereign immunity? What doesn't Russia enjoy sovereign immunity? Which is ridiculous. On one side, they can violate international law and invade a neighboring country, and on the other side, they should be guaranteed protection under international law for their offshore assets. It doesn't make any sense. I don't believe that at the end of the day, it's a legal issue. I think it's ultimately a political issue. It's an issue of political will. To the extent that people say there are legal complications in doing this, well, the way around that is very simple. You legislate around it. In other words, you put up a law in the EU to say that if a country in our part of the world invades a neighboring country and causes enormous damage, then they don't enjoy sovereign immunity and the money can be confiscated. It's very simple. Nobody can then sue anybody in court. But I think at the moment, everybody, particularly in the European Union, there's all this sort of, everybody's looking left and looking right and saying, what does the other guy think? And then you throw into the mix a country like Hungary or Slovakia that are friends of Putin, and that complicates the story even further. In the end, Mr. Sikorski is completely right that why should the European taxpayers pay for this stuff before Putin pays for it? And that will be the end result, but it's going to require some more political will from a lot more countries before we get there.
So you don't buy the theory that this would open a legal Pandora's box here and would encourage other states to retaliate in similar manners in other instances? This is just a lack of political will.
Well, it's not clear what Pandora's box is. I mean, if you create a legislative framework to say that in the very specific circumstances of what's happened here between Russia and Ukraine, that Russia's money is no longer protected, it's very specific. It's a law. If this were to be presented as a law, the law would have been passed, and there you go. I mean, there's a lot of people that think the sky is going to fall if you do this, and that everybody's going to stop investing in Europe. I just don't think that that's the case, because at the end of the day, there's two reserve currencies in the world. There's the US dollar and there's the euro. That's it. And so it's not like the Saudis or other countries are going to be buying Brazilian real to store their money. They'll be continuing to invest in Europe and the United States. That's just how the world works in the world of finance.
Now, based on your experience with Vladimir Putin, what advice would you have for the Trump administration? How should Trump deal with Russia? We often hear that, Vladimir Putin only understands the language of force. But based on what we're seeing, this shift that we've seen since the beginning of July, or potential shift, what do you think the next step should be for the Trump administration in dealing with Ukraine and getting Vladimir Putin to a ceasefire?
Well, Ukraine needs two things. Ukraine needs weapons, offense and defensive weapons, and Ukraine needs money. And so the very simple answer is that the United States should, and everybody else for that matter, should provide the weapons that they're asking for and not put restrictions on the use of those weapons. To say that, we're going to give Ukraine defensive weapons, well, they're going to continue to be bombarded even with their defensive weapons. They need offensive weapons, and to use those offensive weapons to hit military targets in Russia. And Ukraine has been, even with the limited resources they've been very adept at causing Russia unbelievable problems. And then the second thing is that the Ukrainians need is money to buy those weapons and to keep their economy going. And where does that money come from? I think, as we discussed, that money should first and foremost come from the frozen Russian assets. And I think if those two things were accomplished, Ukraine would be in a very strong position. And I would say, just on the other side of this whole story, if Ukraine were to fall, if Ukraine were not to succeed in this war, if Putin were to succeed, the cost to the European Union and to the United States would be exponentially greater in dealing with Russia. And I think people in Poland know this more profoundly than many other places, that we don't want to be at war directly with Russia, but we would be, because Putin's next move would be the Baltics or possibly Poland. And so the Ukrainians are fighting for all of us, not just for themselves.
Certainly is a very important time for Ukraine. Hopefully the politicians around the world can make the right decisions. Sir William Browder, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your analysis.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for watching. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.